I'm going to go ahead and dive in because we have a lot of ground to cover. So I know a bunch of you. My name is Mark Hallett, and I'm Director of Grants Programs here at Illinois Humanities. Thank you all for being here for this special report out. We're really excited to share with all of you sort of a condensed and personalized version of the COVID-19 report, History is Happening, the State of Humanities Organizations in Illinois during COVID-19. That's a mouthful. Before we jump in, because we have a lot to cover, and I don't want to belabor an introduction, but to say that we're going to sort of a little bit about the structure of today's conversation. We're going to hear from Illinois Humanities Executive Director Gabe Lyon on sort of the heart of the findings from this report, which we were really excited to launch a little bit earlier this year. Then I'm going to share a few takeaways that we heard from our interviews with humanities leaders, with humanities stewards, across the state. And then with the help of my colleague Feroz moderating, we're going to open up the floor to hear your responses. And this is really the heart of the program, I think, in smaller breakout groups. And then we'll share back with one another around sort of what resonates for you from the report, from the data, from the narratives, as well as simply what sort of a moment this is for you and for your organization, meaning right now. And then before closing out, we're going to share a few upcoming news items from Illinois Humanities. And if you'd like, always, please share toward the end of the program any upcoming events that you've got and any links that you'd like to share with everyone else on this call today. Does that sound good? So before I welcome Gabe, two sort of quick items, but they're ones that are really important to us. First is to acknowledge the land that we are on this afternoon. So at Illinois Humanities, we respectfully acknowledge that the land on which our main office is located is made up of the lands of the people of Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations, as well as many other tribes who've called this land home, including Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee nations. These nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territories. However, these lands continue to carry the stories, the resilience, and the tenacity of these nations. Despite the federal and local government-enforced policies of genocide of American Indians, Chicago today is home to the third largest urban Indian population, representing actually more than 100 different tribal nations. We also recognize that land acknowledgement statements in and of themselves are most meaningful when coupled with a commitment to programs and actions that support Indigenous rights and cultural equity. Illinois Humanities is in a sense just starting this journey, and we have work to do, but we're committed to sustaining relationships with Indigenous organizations throughout Illinois and to encourage you to support these organizations and efforts as well. So these groups include, and you've probably heard of some of them, maybe not all of them, the American Indian Center, Trickster Cultural Center in Schaumburg, American Indian Health Services, the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian in Evanston, the Center for Native Futures, and Midwest Soaring, among others. So also, with regards to community discussion, we'd like to share what we call our community norms or agreements. This is essentially our way of naming what we consider the ingredients of a healthy and respectful dialogue. So the community agreements that we use are the following. Create space for multiple truths, listen actively and without judgment, commit to speaking in the first person, receive and give feedback respectfully, acknowledge the difference between intention and impact, meaning that things that we say may have a negative impact on others regardless of our personal intent. Each person is coming to the conversation with unique lived experience and embodied expertise. No single one of us knows everything, but together we hold immense knowledge, creativity, and potential. Welcome and maintain space for pause and reflection over the course of our proceedings. Maintain confidentiality when requested. Use discretion if sharing others' reflections outside of this space. And finally, be specific in naming and using language. For instance, it's important to name anti-Black racism or white privilege or white supremacy explicitly. If that sounds good, if anyone would like to add to that, please go ahead and speak up. But we found these to be really helpful and respectful rules. So wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to you, Gabe. I know we're in good hands.
Thank you so much. Wow, it is, Mark, thank you so much for grounding the conversation and our gathering today. Wherever you are in the state, I hope you can take a breath of clean air and that you're cool enough to be comfortable. These are, heady days, but this community is so generative. We are really grateful to just, I think, have the chance to share and talk about this project we've been working on in some ways for the last few years, because so much of the first version of the report we put out and the second version of the report we put out is really intended to help stitch together a story of what our community is doing. And that community is fragmented. We don't always know each other, but this story is something that has become integral for our way of thinking about ourselves and how we can contribute and collaborate. But also, we just want to make sure that we are like sharing back with all of you and our grantee partner community in particular, because it's this information that we're piecing together is very much based on information you shared. So it's both to have the conversation, but also out of a sense of responsibility. And I especially want to call out some of the folks that worked hard on what I'm about to share. Actually, the entire IH team that's with us: Tia Williams, Mark Hallett, Martin Kraus, Jen Yu, Firuz Abu-Ghazel, and Joanne Su, Chu, and Zerlene Thompson. I think I've gotten everyone. If not, my apologies. But these folks were really integral. But I also want to call out Monica Felix and Sue Scott, who I think were really ready ears as we tried to put this together in a way that was true and responsive, but also intelligible. So just a quick show of hands, how many folks have had a chance to page through this idea of this State of the Humanities report or read the cheat sheet? If you didn't, it's fine, but if you want to put a little emoji up or something, great, awesome. If you didn't, this is a kind of 30,000 foot view. The richness is really the stories. But one of the questions is that we get asked, I don't know if you get asked, is well, what are the humanities? And it's all of these things, right? It's art, it's ethics, it's history, it's philosophy, it's literature. But really for Illinois Humanities, it's the practice of being together. And so whether you find yourself identified in one of these words or not, I promise you that all of us today are involved in things that help us to frankly be more human and be more human with one another. And that's the drive. That's, what we share irrespective of the mode. So this report that came out that we published at the very end of March, by the skin of our teeth at the end of March 2023, uses a couple of key sources for the data, right? When we say the data, it's quantitative, it's qualitative, but the report information that you all shared as part of your applications and reports, interviews that you were so good to share with us. And then we worked really hard to kind of access other public data to try to understand, well, okay, we can figure out where everybody is and start to understand what are people doing and what are they struggling with, but what is the context for that work? What does that mean in practice day to day? And so we use census data, health data, we looked at broadband data, we looked at economic well-being data. So we didn't create any of those data sets, but we really wanted to kind of benefit from those contexts. And we tried to do a lot of, kind of research along the way, again, benefiting from other people's work by correlation. And the report hopefully comes out as really trying to center our grantee partners. We're not evaluating the quality of your work. We're not saying this money enabled programs to make people's lives so much better, which we hope it did, but that's not what the effort was about. It was really about trying to start to paint a picture and describe this ecosystem. So I want to just highlight a couple of the findings that we think are relevant because they're things that we share in our practices, in some ways, irrespective of whether we're in arts-based or poetry writing or performance dialogue space or, an archive or a history center. There's some things that we're sharing by being organizations involved in the act of public humanities. Again, what it means to be with one another. So, when we talk about, what are we talking about? We gave away about $2.4 million. Almost all of that came from the federal government. It came to us because we're the state partner for the National Endowment for the Humanities. So those were funds that were given us to give away. They didn't tell us how to do it, how fast to do it, what size. They were just like, here's the money, make relief happen. When we tally it all up, we reached organizations in about 78 counties, 359 unique organizations. And then we wanted to know, okay, but what else can we know? Well, here's something really important. More than almost half have operating budgets of less than $100,000. That implies some things that you know well, which is the only way it works is because you have volunteers or you have an unbelievably dedicated staff or part-time staff or no staff, but you're keeping the lights on, paying rent. It's really a really critical indicator. The other thing is, sure, about 40% were created in the last 20 years. That's an interesting story, but some of our folks, some of our community members are more than a century old. This is a big spectrum. And, one of the things that I think we feel like we also need to honor is we gave away $2.4 million. That seems like a lot. It's way more than we generally get to give away. But when we asked people how much they really lost, it was, more than 10 times that, maybe $24 million in revenue collectively was not brought in. So of course, our grant making's a pittance. But I think the other thing we're really trying to understand and what we hope this conversation, gets at was the fact that folks weren't able to reach their people. And that's our missions. So how is that going right now? How is that feeling? People did lots of things with funding, hired people, paid people, figured out how to host conversations virtually. But the other thing that happened during this period, and it speaks to what it means to work in community, is also function sometimes as first responders, sharing food, sharing information, sometimes sharing information in a language or using a means that your communities would be able to receive. And again, when we start to understand what does it mean to be a public humanities organization in the state of Illinois, that's part of what it means. The other thing that we really wanted to understand was, okay, day in and day out, geography matters. So one of the things that surfaced when we pulled all this data together that we really didn't appreciate beforehand is that 60% of our grantee partners, again, that's the folks in this room, are serving communities that were under economic duress before the pandemic even unfolded. A quarter of grantee partners are providing programming in places that had more COVID cases than the statewide average. And 2 in 3 of our grantee partners are operating in places without sufficient broadband access. We can unpack some of those things. Some of these points may be true for you, maybe all of them are. But when people start to talk about the impact of the pandemic and what it means to bring folks together, this issue about broadband becomes way more acute. And the last thing is just back to the commitment to kind of transparency and trying to build capacity across our community. As part of the report, we built an interactive map And we built a directory. And if one of my team can drop those links, if you haven't already, in the chat, those are supposed to help us whenever we want on demand. But that's part of what we did with this report. Just a couple of other points that I think are really important as Illinois Humanities is thinking about who we can be as our best selves amongst our community of practitioners. 48% of our grantee partners are operating in rural areas. So, less than 12% of Illinoisans live in what's considered a non-metro area, but we really are designing our funding to try to reach communities in small towns and rural communities. And if you're doing some of that work, we have some of our rural foreground hubs, and Ferus is helping to lead the team. The other is, unlike the vast majority of kind of the nonprofit sector, more than a third of our organizations have staff that are at least 50% Black, Indigenous, people of color. That is quite above the norm for the nonprofit sector. Now, that doesn't mean everybody everywhere all the time, but what we're really trying to say is, what is this statewide community like? What's going on with it? What can help us know ourselves? And so these are some points that have been helpful for us to understand. I talked a little bit about COVID. I'm not going to spend more time into that, but I do want to just point out the difference between April of 2020 and August of 2022, which is when this funding was going out. So the dark blue is incidence of COVID. When we started, we weren't really sure how this pandemic was going to lay out. 2 years later, it was really clear it had reached all of us. And broadband is something we're starting to pay a lot of attention to, in part because broadband can enable broader, easier access to audiences and communities we might not otherwise reach or bridge. But if there's no broadband, then, I know there are people on this call that I sometimes have tried to have a Zoom with, and we can't even Zoom because the internet's not reliable, right? So that's our reality. And just a reminder, every point on this map, you guys were doing, and we were doing, programming in service to our communities through our mission while COVID was happening. If you're feeling a little tired, let's just take a breath right now all together. This is good, important work. The humanities enable us to be more human with one another. And we know this from the stories, and Mark's going to talk a little bit about some of that, but our research into big research shops that this is what they do. What are they helping us understand and proving that maybe we have a harder time doing? And over again, the things that come up is that our work, our practices foster belonging. They mitigate social isolation. They make places more livable, and ultimately strengthen the civic fabric that we need to be able to participate and thrive. And so, kudos to you guys, kudos to us. When we think of this map, every point represents work that is going on. It doesn't all look the same, but the kinds of practices and commitments are extraordinarily in kindred spirit. And the last thing is, we're at a really critical moment of opportunity. If your demand has gone up, but it's harder to deliver programs, that may not be unusual for your fellow community members, because coming out of the pandemic in particular, people are really looking to us, our place-based organizations, to be more active, to be in their communities. They want to see themselves. And those are things that many of you have been working on long before the pandemic, but people are actually calling for it now. So yeah, the conversation today, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark, is really about, it's been a rough couple of years. In some ways, the things that were rough before the pandemic. But the possibility is is huge. And so the conversation today, how are you doing? What's going on? What can we learn from each other? That's part of us capitalizing on the demand and the possibility. And again, just want to thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and then we're going to open it up for a few questions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Gabe. That was amazing. So I'm going to continue to help paint the picture of how we saw our public humanities colleagues respond to the pandemic. It's really interesting because the data points collectively tell, as Gabe has shown, a really compelling sort of myriad of stories, but also contributing to each data point, there are multiple stories yearning to be told too. And so I'm going to begin with the story of one small town library and the creative ways that they found to help keep patrons happy and engaged during the pandemic, which could be so isolating, as we all know. Then I'm going to share several impressions around how groups fared during the pandemic from the interviews that we conducted. And then, as you guys know, we're gonna turn to you all to hear more about your experiences. So Allison Thompson, the director of the Marshall Public Library, had a hunch that historic photos would be popular with library patrons. She knew a community historian in the central eastern Illinois town, Eleanor Mack, who she believed had a stash of great photos. One day, after she asked Eleanor if she'd share photos, the community historian opened her purse and took out a little bag with 10 USBs containing more than 3,000 photos of the town. My heart skipped a beat, Allison told us. Gosh, what if she loses that bag? When March 17th, 2020, the first day of the pandemic, as you all remember, hit, the library reached out to Eleanor again, asking if they could access her collection. They asked if she'd prepare photos with a brief snippet sort of describing each. Well, Eleanor and a group of her friends went a step further and wrote short stories to accompany each of the thousands of images. The library posted one photo on Facebook every day for a year. It was more popular than we could have ever imagined. People were stuck at home looking for a mission, a purpose, and the library was closed. People would stop me at the grocery store then and tell me how much they loved learning about Marshall's history, Allison told us. The local paper started featuring the photos, and after the library secured a grant from the Illinois Heartland Library System, the photos and oral histories went online in a searchable format on the Illinois Digital Archives website. In a town of 8,000 people, one photo actually had more than 7,000 likes. This site will preserve our little town's local history, which we couldn't be any happier about, says Allison. So a library that began the pandemic by canceling 2 exhibits, found ways to continue a reading program, maintain field trips to the library, and as described above, post a series of historic photos that now has totally, in aggregate, more than 100,000 likes. So this is just one example of the ingenuity that we saw in community-based humanities organizations as they stepped up throughout the pandemic to support their communities in ways that are truly remarkable. And as Gabe said, we know that it wasn't easy. Through our conversations with nonprofit partners across the state, we heard some variation of the following. The Great Resignation, remember all the talk about that, impacted the nonprofit cultural sector with a lot of turnover happening and disrupting programs. In some cases, in particular with small staffs, the person leaving might have been the main contact for a programmatic partnership or to a donor or to a funder. Cultural groups had to compete with large corporate workplaces in terms of salary and in terms of benefits. In a number of cases, organizational founders either moved on or passed on. In some cases, the rent that nonprofits pay was raised exorbitantly, which was accentuated, of course, during a time of high inflation. Some seemingly stalwart supporters of cultural work changed their priorities in response to the pandemic. So there seems to be cases of a silver lining, though they aren't many. And sometimes come with questions attached. People's desire to have meaning in their lives in some cases meant that boards benefited by having more people who were working in the corporate sector with some specialized skill sets and wanted to help out by joining a nonprofit board. While some newer funders stepped up during the pandemic, it still remains to be seen whether they'll continue to be on board for the long haul in their support of cultural nonprofits. The result or net change, according to one person we talked with, Jean Schultz-Angel at Neighbor Settlement and on the board of the Illinois Association of Museums, is that smaller cultural groups are entering 2023 with very different financial scenarios. Some seem to be really hurting and others seem to be flush. All of this makes it really hard to predict where groups are going to be at the end of this year. And equally turbulent is another factor, and that's kind of the whole area of programming and the programs that we all put on. So again, Jean Schultz-Angel talked about how museums were being challenged to ask afresh, are we doing this right? Like field trips, for example, she told us that we've always done them, but are we doing them right? Are there things we should be doing differently to help serve schools, classrooms, teachers, and kids? We also talked with Monica Felix, the ED at the Chicago Cultural Alliance. And one of the things that she talked about was sort of questioning the DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusivity language that many funders have adapted. And so while this language names some really key concerns sort of explicitly, which seems like a powerful contribution to the field, it might also be language that many cultural groups themselves aren't accustomed to using. So in some cases, it might be that this is another example of funders sort of dictating a certain language to a sector, right? So that's just a little bit of what we heard. There's much more. But the most compelling takeaways for us, I have to say, we're hearing about the creative ways that groups responded. The American Indian Center took a huge financial hit, yet still hosted their 67th annual powwow as a virtual event. They also took on food distribution, and we know that many of our partners across the state took on sort of an emergency role in that way. The Bronzeville Historical Society lost its space at the beginning of the pandemic, but managed to continue doing weekly African-American genealogy workshops. Mind's Eye Radio in Belleville, which has numerous programs for people with visual disabilities, lost earned revenue when venues stopped asking for help with audio visuals during the pandemic. And then networks of groups like the Chicago Cultural Alliance have responded and stepped up through some of the most powerful and creative ways that we could imagine, and that's through collective work and partnerships. So there you have it. This is sort of, between Gabe's comments and mine, a little bit of a report in condensed form. And so now we'd really, really like to hear what this moment is like for you all, and also your responses to what we've laid out. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my wonderful colleague, Ferouz, our Director of Statewide Programming, and she's going to help moderate this next segment. Ferouz?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Gabe, for this informative and very valuable context for where we are right now. And this was a lot of information, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of you. And so this is the time, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the team or anything that just comes to mind, feel free to either raise your hand and we can go ahead and unmute you, or you can put your question in the chat. We will go into breakout soon, so we'll have a chance to talk in smaller groups. But if there is any question that you have right now that you want to share with all of us, or questions for the team, or anything about the report, this is your chance.
Well, if I can say something, my name is Henry Roa. You can hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Henry.
I'm with the Mexican Folkloric Dance Company of Chicago. We are into our 42nd year. And when the pandemic hit, we lost 22 months of income. But this humanities grant really saved us. You know, we're a small company, even though we've been in business more than 42 years. This grant, this humanities, it was a real lifesaver. But of course, we did get grants from the state and the city, Illinois Arts Council. We've been getting those for almost 40 years. But I'd like to keep applying to the Illinois Humanities. It really helped during the pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that, Henry. That's great to hear. And I'm sorry about the challenges you had to go through. I think, Megan, you had your hand raised.
Yes, hi, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Carney. I'm Artistic Director of About Face Theater in Chicago. Thank you so much for this report, for the labor that went into it and the good listening that you all have been doing, and for this space today. I'm really grateful to, you know, be rounded up like this and have a chance to see faces and connect and reflect a little bit. And I know that certainly in our organization, the reflection and response around these conditions is ongoing. You know, I mean, it's built into how we do our programming anyway, always reflecting how can we do it better or have different impacts, or what do we want to do next? And this might be a premature question, but I'm curious if you all have had a chance to reflect on what does this mean for the Humanities Council, the learning that you've been doing, and having put this report together. Do you know yet how it might impact the work that you all are doing, and the ways that we might be connecting with each other? Curious to hear anything that you're thinking about.
That is an excellent question, Megan. Thank you so much for asking it. And I think that's one of the very few, I think, good things that came out of the pandemic, is that we were all forced to just slow down and stop and reflect, and think about how we want to continue moving forward. And I've seen a lot of positive things come out of that. Also, you know, just in general, but also internally. And I want to open it up for any of the IH staff if they want to answer that or share anything.
Yeah. Maybe I can, Megan, it's so great to have you with us, and thank you for your work under duress at various times, but I'm sure you've got your hands full now as well. I'll say a couple of things. I think Illinois Humanities has always been partner-centered. And that is just kind of, and I hope that is also how you feel. I will say that the last couple of years, we'd already started, I've been at the organization about 4 years, we'd already started to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be evidence-based in our decision-making? So that was something we were trying to bake in. COVID hit, and the sheer volume of grant making, you know, we're talking about, as you saw, almost 400 grants, but there were multiple grants that went out the door in a very short period of time, was ironically a really huge opportunity for the curious amongst us who wanted to understand the picture in aggregate. And that first wave of dollars that went out the door, which for us was about 60,000 that we repurposed from our regular budget immediately before we knew there was federal dollars, illuminated a couple of things that I think over the last couple of years, we've really tried to bake in. I think one is the acute realization that small towns and rural communities sometimes didn't even have access to other funders. And that was really eye-opening in a way that I think we always kind of sensed it, but to just look at those numbers and to understand what was happening in this crisis. The second thing was really understanding that we could do a much better job being as clear as we could, that grant dollars were actually for you. if you are in a small town, if you are outside of Cook County. And so some of you may have experienced it when we set up 2 different portals, for example. And a lot of other things have subsequently been brought online and tested out to take applications over the phone, for example, or try to do things in different languages, for example. So I think we're constantly iterating to reduce the barriers and gates. But I think the second thing is, and your question kind of posing towards the future, is something that for me in this role has been really important as the ED, which is to take this work that has been so implicit in our practice, which is about relationships, and being extremely explicit that that's actually one of the best things we can be investing in. And so bolstering that grant making with community conversations, convening, community building. And so I'm sorry to go on for so long, but I think that our hope is over the next couple of months, we'll be finishing a strategic plan. We haven't had one in 10 years. And that what that's going to let us do is name explicitly some of the ways in which it's important for us to work. Absolutely our values, a commitment to kind of actively being active about having an equity lens and what that means. But I think a couple of things. One is increasing the grants that we can get out the door, trying to figure out how to do that, having a more comprehensive grants program, but really bolstering grant making, which is how we opened our door almost 50 years ago, with the kind of wraparound of community and capacity building towards this end of us being stronger all together. So those are some of the things.
That's huge. Thank you.
This is Mark. Thanks for a great question, Megan. And if I could just quickly sort of tag on a little bit more to what Gabe just went through, because I think she summarized it really well. And this will sound a little bit operational, but it gets to Gabe's point that we're trying really, really hard to grow the grants program. And by the way, and so these are, I'm going to run through a few things that basically, if we jump back in time, pre-March 2020, we weren't doing them, they didn't exist. As Gabe said, doing applications and final reports by interview, bringing Foundant on as a platform, right? Bringing on board my colleague, Joanne Chu, who's amazing and is part of the grants team now, right? So we're staffing up to be able to do more, doing more convenings and providing capacity building opportunities, providing more in the area of communications, monthly spotlights, an e-newsletter for partners across the state, starting to tell stories of impact. And so those are operational, but it's a lot about relationship building. And frankly, and finally, the Foreground Rural Initiative, right? The support for that initiative came in response to the pandemic grant making that we were doing as a team. And so those are just a few of the ways that I think we're on a learning trajectory, right? And trying to be stronger supporters and better supporters in different ways. And those are a few of them.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Megan, for a great question. Any other questions before we go into breakouts? Erin was, yeah, I thought Erin had her, but I think she's, okay. All right, how about then we go into breakouts right now? And I think here's what we're gonna do. Where you'll find yourself, I think, in a group. If you have a problem going into that, just let us know. Together, we're going to try to answer 3 questions, which are, what about the report resonates with you? How is your organization doing right now, now that the pandemic has receded? And how might this report or data be useful for you? And of course, if we have time, if you want to say something that you're most proud of or what you would have done differently looking back, that's also wonderful. It would be fantastic if at the beginning of the group, at the beginning of the discussion, you can assign somebody who's going to report out so that we can have a share out afterwards. And I think, yeah, and we have 20 minutes. And we will have a reminder when we're down to about 1 minute, just so that we can keep track of time. So And yeah, you should see it right now pop up. So we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you for coming back. How was it? How was the discussion? I think we could have spent another hour pondering some of these questions. So we can jump right in, and if anybody would like to share, some of the highlights or what was talked about in your group or something that stuck with you, I think we'd all appreciate it.
I can go ahead and start. My name is Bobby Perryman. I'm the director of the Vespasian Warner Public Library District in Clinton. I'm from a small rural community, and Michelle and Vicki, who are also in my group, are also from small institutions. So for the three of us, the things that we really got out of the report were, rural communities exist and we're there, and we're so often forgotten. What was wonderful about this program with Illinois Humanities is that we weren't forgotten, and that our contributions to the state as a whole were acknowledged, and the help that we really needed was given to us. So for proudest accomplishments during COVID, I think Michelle at DeKalb had a great program that she did, bringing together different local history groups and building trust and building partnerships with all the groups in the county to help share the history of DeKalb with the people there, and building up those audiences again. Vicki kept providing service with her public library, even when they were shut down. The service to the community never stopped, even if it meant mailing things to kids for summer reading, delivering things to people's homes. The library was still there even when their building was shut down. And for her proudest accomplishment was also their local ladies organization came back. Everybody came back to the library after things were open again, and we're excited to. And today, as far as our institutions today, all of us are really excited. Some of the skills that we have might be a little bit rusty, especially like programming skills, but our communities are happy to have us open, and we're excited to be doing things in the communities again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bobby. Yeah, it's great to be able to start meeting in person again, and having the community come back together. And thank you for sharing that. And I think in our group, the focus on the rural areas also resonated. So I'm glad to hear that too. Anybody else?
I can go if you'd like, Fairuz.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. Go ahead.
Our group included a good balance between rural folks. We had Chris from Fulton County Arts and Grace up in Altoona and Historical Society, and up in Fairuz. And then in Chicago, we had Monica at the CCA and Eloise from the Haitian American Museum. So we had a good conversation about what resonated, and it was based in, again, the recognition that we all felt that we were represented both in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas. And this idea that rural folks seem to this came through a lot with the rural people on the group, that there's sort of a grant limbo land for us smaller organizations in rural areas that don't have access to sort of corporate funding or larger grants. And that really was well represented, they thought, within the report. It was also mentioned that the size of the grants were sort of not necessarily going to make any dramatic change. They filled in the gaps, was the word. And if the application process being so simple and accessible allowed people to sort of do aggregate grants that actually ended up having a larger impact on the organization. So that was well received or resonated with some people. On the mission side, and the way that the depiction of the humanities was stated really resonated with a couple of us who felt that it was aligned with what we thought the humanities were. It was accessible and easy to understand. And it seemed like this idea of a lifeline to connection was brought up for what we experienced through the COVID times, as well as how we want to represent our organizations to the community. Also, we thought it was really well balanced in terms of representing each of the types of organizations, whether it was size or location or economic standing. So we thought it was a very balanced report. We only got to 2 questions. So the other one was, how are we doing now? And there was a couple things. Everybody seemed really excited. We had heard about some new activities and programs that Grace was doing that was bringing her community together, and everybody was like, do more, do more. And then on the other side, we talked about the roller coaster ride of doing more, and then being able to sort of, how do we manage that, and how do we build the staff? And we heard that the Great Resignation had impacted the CCA, and how a conservative sort of fiscal positioning of her decision-making was helping them get through that. And the programs are becoming stronger as a result of that. So the roller coaster ride to some more stability. Also, we found and heard from Chris that there's a lack still of community support that she's feeling, and she sees the lingering effects of mental health that's been a challenge for that organization to sort of address or overcome or work through. So anybody else on our group, please feel free to jump in and add anything that I did not include.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was great. You captured pretty much everything that we had talked about. It was a great discussion. What about some of the other groups? Anything that you would like to share?
I'm happy to represent my group. Sorry, Megan, I think I saw you, the international lean, unmute, then remute. Hi, everyone. Lauren, pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the managing director of Second Story. I'm representing a mighty group that spent the majority of our time just talking about the first question. So just a major round of applause to the Illinois Humanities for putting together such a robust, nearly 90-page document. It is rich with data and stories, and so a lot of gratitude there. Many thanks to Martin for actually answering a handful of our questions that we had specifically about, a couple of sections within the report, which is what ate up the balance of our time. I know that I found figure 2 on page 45, the funds per resident, to be particularly interesting as you think about the breakdown between Chicago and then the rest of the state. So thank you, Martin, for adding a little bit of context to that. Always looking for those fun nuggets of data. Because we didn't talk about questions 2 or 3, the thing that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years as I run a small nonprofit that's located on the Northwest side is certainly lifting up the resilience. And I think I'm tired of saying the word like pivot, that we've all pivot. So now I've adopted swivels, the swivels that we've done over the last 3 years. So congratulating you all on that. And I know that from the seat that I'm sitting in, that the curiosity I have is like, how do we leverage the learnings and the investments made over the last 3 years to inform future programmatic decisions? So Second Story invested really heavily in a hybrid model. How do we maintain that to not lose the virtual audience that we cultivated across the state of Illinois and beyond? And how do those lessons just inform us, not only in the present, but the future? I can hand it off to Shayna or Derek if either of you would like to add anything to this brief snapshot of our conversation.
Did a great job. Thank you.
I love the swivels. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to steal that one.
I'm sure I stole it from somebody, so the community can borrow it, and yes, we can just have everybody use swivel until we're back to pivot.
We'll see how long that takes. Thank you for that. And I loved what you said. How do we leverage the learnings and investments to inform our work moving ahead? Thank you for that. I think we have 2 more groups. Anybody would like to share?
I was going to nominate Carol from our group, group 4. Carol, would you mind?
here. There we go. So my name is Carol Kuntz, and I'm with Les Amis de Fort de Chartres. It's a support organization, cultural support organization for Fort de Chartres State Historic Site. But and our group really impacts our region, the events and the work that we do, preserving 300-year-old history in our region really is an economic driver within our community. But in our group session with Geraldo and Margaret, it was really great to hear about their organizations and, like Les Amis, the opportunities that Illinois Humanities through their COVID funding have helped stabilize our organizations during COVID, and also offered opportunities for us to maybe look at things a little differently as we all were kind of in pause at different times and had challenges. As we've come out of it, some of the, I think the communication and the sharing helped us maybe imagine and expand into different areas that we can take forward into the future. As far as current status, everybody seems to be doing well. Les Amis has a few challenges that probably are a little different than some of the other smaller organizations. As an all-volunteer organization, we have, and due to the kind of work we do, hosting large events and so on, we have some issues related to volunteer retention and since COVID, and funding, and just inflation, how inflation has impacted us. But both Margaret and Geraldo seemed both to are coming out of it pretty stable and very expanding their ideas for movement in the future. And if either one of you, Margaret or Geraldo, want to add to that, please, Ronaldo, sorry. If you want to add to that, please do.
Hey, you can call me anything you want.
I'm sorry.
I already have adopted you. I love you. Don't call me late for dinner. No, you did an amazing job. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Carol. I love the imagine and expand. Thank you for that, and for the share out. I think we have one last group.
Yes, we do. They nominated me at the very end, so
Go ahead, Megan.
Scribble my notes. Yes, I think there was a lot of identification with the report, and it resonated with some good stories that came out of our group. We were 3 live performing, 4 live performing organizations and 1 film festival, and so we were sort of connecting around the opportunities, or maybe silver linings, was how a lot of things were getting framed in the group. For example, loss of live audiences, but figuring out streaming platforms as a way to keep a film festival going, and sort of reimagining how that could work. Developing a curriculum around, being more trauma informed with youth, and then the ability to expand with a lot of national partnerships online that wouldn't have happened if that were delivered only in person. Another story about an education program kind of dissolving as a result of not being able to tour, but then that birthing a whole new program about how to be back together in person as we're coming back to live production. And I think a discovery, a story about discovering the need for more grants, like the need to diversify how to stay afloat, and how to get different kinds of applications in. So those are some of the takeaways. I think that themes of like letting go of old ways of doing things and inviting in experimentation, curiosity, new ideas, different ways of working. And also thinking about the arts and the humanities more broadly as really actively leading in the need for healing and wellness and recovery that's ongoing in so many of our communities. And how do we continue to kind of expand how we work and what we offer to be deeply rooted in the moment that we're all experiencing, So I think that was what I took away from it. I want to open it up for the group to add in.
Seeing some members giving you a thumbs up and a shout out. So thank you for that, Megan. That sounds like you guys had an amazing discussion, epitomizing the creativity of your organizations. So thank you for that. Thank you all so much for taking the time to just have this discussion. I think it's really valuable, and we don't always have these spaces to talk with one another and support each other. So thank you so much for being so generous. And now I think I hand it back to Mark.
Yes, thank you, Veros. Thank you, everyone. Wow, what an amazing discussion. I was planning to do some sort of a summary, and I heard these incredible, spirited, beautifully articulated statements. Not even going to go there. Thank you to each and every one of you for being part of these discussions and for sharing out the way that you did. You can see why for us, we're such strong believers in convening, right? In coming together, in just sharing the rich nature of the work that we all do. It's just so utterly powerful. So Gabe, I think we're ready to just do a quick wrap up and with a few announcements. Yeah. If I'm forgetting anything, let me know.
No, you're perfect. You're perfect, as is often the case.
Thank you. And while I'm sharing out a few Illinois Humanities upcoming dates and things, if anyone wants to post about an event or a link you want us to know about, etc., from your own shops, this is the time. So please go right ahead and drop it in the chat. We'd love to know what you're doing. And I'm sure a lot of us would love to be present at programming that you're doing. So quickly, so Activate History. These are the micro grants that are meant to help create engagement with local archives and collections. And we're going to be doing a webinar on how to apply for the September 1st deadline, which is coming up. The webinar is also coming up. It's going to be next Tuesday, July 25th at 1 o'clock. It'd be great to see a link dropped in the chat if it isn't already. And if not, we'll send it out later also. We also have another deadline coming up. It's a general operating or unrestricted grants deadline, which will be September 15th. We held a webinar on this program and how to apply, etc. on June 6th. We recorded it for anyone who couldn't be there. And so we went through the overview of the program, questions around eligibility, how to apply, etc. And so we're going to drop a link to that recording in the chat, and we'll share it out. Envisioning Justice is holding an activation series 2023. There are a bunch of events coming up all over the state of Illinois from basically now through November. So look for events coming up in Carbondale, East St. Louis, and elsewhere. I think it's 6 events in total, maybe. And so there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up in that arena. And the final one that I've got is Spark Illinois. And so this is an initiative created in partnership with the Smithsonian, and these are exhibits and events that are focusing on creative economic development in small towns across the state of Illinois. And so this traveling exhibit is currently up in Equality, I think maybe for like 2 more days, if I'm not mistaken. And then in coming months, it's going to appear in Hillsborough, Chatsworth, Rushville, Durant, Havana, and Marshall. And so you can see a list of upcoming events. And I am pulling up the chat for myself and seeing that people have drop some things in. Beautiful, beautiful. This is so exciting. I think we're there. Yeah, go ahead.
So Mark, I'll pick up the kind of the threads and tie our knot for today. You know, we are talking to you as grantee partners and program partners. And one of the things we don't always do a great job of is also highlighting some of the other programs. We're trying to do a better job. Definitely keep an eye on our events calendar. So we have an incredible cohort of Rhodes Scholars. If you like this kind of conversation and gathering, the Rhodes Scholars programs, which happen all over the state, are another opportunity to come together. I also wanted to just mention two other things. Executive directors have been gathering the first Friday of the month, and thanks to Joanne, who helps me make sure that I get to each one and don't miss a beat. That's something that if you're in that kind of role of responsibility, please join us, just because it can be cold and lonely out there, even on a hot day if you're an ED, because you're always in the hot seat. So if you're interested in joining, please shoot any of us an email and we'll make sure you're not already on that invitation list, that you have that. And you know, most of all, like, thank you so much for having us be part of this community. We are trying to be our best selves and feel a lot of responsibility of what it means to be an organization committed to the state. Because at the end of the day, there's really no such thing as the state. It's always about local. It's always about our places. It's always about our conversations together. So I'm very grateful for that responsibility, but it's one that we make together. And just how these conversations unfolded with curiosity and sincerity, I think we all want a little more of that grace in our lives. And so I thank you for what you do every single day, because that's how it rolls when you're with the humanities. Thanks to the team for getting us together. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Great rest of your Thursday, and we'll be in touch soon. Keep an eye out for the Grantee Partner newsletter, and if you have something to share, definitely share it, because we want to share it too. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.